And I guess this is the part where I take over. If I could ask Kenneth to switch off the camera so that we have our lovely panelists in the view. Okay, hello and welcome to the, depending on where you are, afternoon session of the CST conference, and welcome to the internet, because this is what we're going to talk about, the internet and as television. And we have three speakers today. We are going to start with David, and then we have JP's paper and lastly Mareike's paper. We have Owen, who is our chat monitor. So if there's anything you would like to put as comments in the chat, you are very welcome to do so during the presentations. The discussion will happen at the end after we've listened to all three papers, and we would like you to use the raise hand function, the virtual hand, to say that you want to say something. And other than that, I think we are ready to get started. So we will start with David, David Levent-Palatinos, who is talking about streaming trends and platform wars, shifting trends, and the case of the expanse. David is a lecturer in digital media and cultural studies at the University of Rožomberok, and he's the founder of the Anthropocene Media Lab at the Technical University of Liberec. He has been the co-editor with Elke of the eCrea section of CST Online since 2014, and his research moves between and across visual studies, digital media, and cultural theory. So welcome, David, and the screen is yours, as we are now saying.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me fine, I hope. So I'm going to start my screen sharing. Yeah. Okay, I have to apologize. This is the only way for me to share the presentation with you because I'm using Keynote rather than PowerPoint, and it doesn't allow me to go full screen with the slides. I mean, I can go full screen with the slides, but only I would see them full screen. You would still see the same. So I hope that you're not too uncomfortable with seeing what's on the left-hand side of the presentation. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me just begin by saying that it's just uncanny how these meetings in virtual space have become the norm over the past year and a half. I'm only mentioning this because this current format is particularly fitting, even conducive to what I want to talk about today. As we are still in various degrees of isolation, reliant on screens for communication, work, and entertainment, still experiencing various degrees of claustrophobia. Today's talk inscribes itself into the ongoing repositioning of screen culture in general and into the discourse and the relation between the apparent upheaval of certain niche television genres, changes in content consumption practices during lockdown, and the critical discourse on what has been frequently dubbed as platform wars. I will now say a few words about why The Expanse is considered iconic, not just me, but by a considerable body of criticism, not scholarly literature per se, but criticism. And I opted to actually show you this particular image, which was taken from a fan community Facebook page called Everything is Expanse, and is in fact a fan art, because I think it demonstrates quite nicely the complexity of the narrative. So those of you who are familiar with The Expanse are in luck. Those of you who are not, I am hoping I will be able to at least make you interested in it. So this talk is also to briefly demonstrate how multifaceted this production is, partly precisely because of the engagement that we see in the fandom, the paraphernalia constructed around everything the expense, and how the show's content, the underlying concept, reaches beyond the immediate context of the show to encompass various aspects of public discourse, including practices of memification and forms of popular allegorization, where superfans would obviously see and comment on everything in the public sphere through the lens of the expanse, from the Perseverance landing on Mars to Bernie Sanders, to space probes sending back images and data from celestial bodies, to obviously Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos' respective space flights of late. So I'm also interested in this kind of repurposing of the expense. And to illustrate what I have to say, most of those images that I am going to show you today are either screen grabs from the expense itself, or they have been pulled from that Facebook page, Everything the Expense, to also comment on how the fandom engages with things around the expense. So this TV series was actually acquisitioned by Amazon Prime after Sci-Fi, the original network, was going to cancel the show after 3 seasons in spite of very high ratings. This is obviously not an unprecedented move. Examples of revived shows include Arrested Development, The Killing, Black Mirror, Lucifer, and The Mindy Project, just to mention a few. And also there's a plethora of programs brought back by popular demand. Matt Hill and Jonathan Gray write about these, and examples would include Star Trek, even Doctor Who. Now, from a television studies perspective, what's interesting to ask is what happens to the program and what happens to the viewers when such a transition takes place. All the pertaining publicity, the discussions in the fandom, and all the paraphernalia surrounding the expense provide a good example of practice for all these questions. I, however, approach the expense not only as yet another example of sci-fi television or space opera, but also as an example of practice of what Mark Bold called the Anthropocene unconscious. So unconscious, I don't think I need to explain the Anthropocene, but the unconscious perhaps deserves an explanation. The unconscious in the title of his book refers to how culture mediates ways in which the Anthropocene manifests texts that are not overtly about climate change, the scarcity of resources, and the impacts of human action on the global ecosystem. It also embodies what elsewhere I termed Anthropocene television, because it mobilizes classic tropes of post-colonial discourse, social polarization, biopower, genetic engineering, in the context of perpetual war and a culture of paranoia. The series' emblematic rendition of the protomolecule, an alien technology that is also a life form, as enemy and as wholly other, imprinted on irrevocably earthbound humans, and always already in the process of becoming, can be seen as a structural virus that decenters the human, rendering it alien within familiar structures. And this is, I think, an experience that we can all relate to in the light of the pandemic. So therefore, the series reflects cultural anxieties and ethical dilemmas about the future, especially from the perspective of our present historical time of the pandemic, when our sense of security has become eroded in relation to our own identity. The expense brings into play anxieties that Claire Colebrook refers to in an essay called The Future is Already Deterritorialized as existential threats to the anthropos. These anxieties unmask the existential fragility of the human. These are pandemics, viral or alien invasions, systemic collapse, the depletion of resources, and of course, climate catastrophe. These narratives also mobilize the trope of survival, where humanity is set against its own non-being and is constituted as that which needs to be saved by destroying that existential threat. The main narrative arc of The Expanse revolves around the idea of we must be saved, emphasis on the we. Now, where The Expanse changes the usual post-apocalyptic and science fiction narrative is precisely the repositioning of this we, because it constantly asks who this we refers to. To paraphrase Derrida from Archive Fever, who is this we that can say who? The Expanse introduces this immanent heterogeneity, even dividedness of the we, of the anthropos as a species. Earthers, Martians, and Belters are always at each other's throat, only temporarily unified when threatened existentially by the protomolecule, which is both a life form and a technology, a wholly other non-human, humanized in the form of hybrids and eventually weaponized. Interestingly, the protomolecule remains a lot more anthropomorphic throughout the series, its sole purpose being to colonize worlds and to fend off existential threats. The conflicts of The Expanse offer parabolistic reflections on capitalistic and colonial logic, not simply in the colonization and terraforming of Mars. We can think about Bruno Latour's famous note, we are earthbound and there's no plan or no planet B. And in the unpacking of the ensuing conflict and rivalry between Earth, which is privileged, wealthy, but in the state of environmental and systemic decline, and Mars, an emerging military power boasting advanced military technology, but also described as a group of dreamers, with the dream of Mars becoming a trope that gets gradually deconstructed through the seasons. But we can say the same about the depiction of the drive to explore and exploit the new worlds that become available when the protomolecule creates the ring gates, which function as portals to unknown universes. And this newfound opportunity is bound to offset the balance of powers between the three players. Season 4 is dedicated in its entirety to the depiction of the turmoils of that exploration drive, that colonization drive, if you like, where both a group of Belters and Earth Corporation attempt to claim a new planet, Islus, or New Terra, as they would call it. Both parties are interested in exploiting the planet for rare earth elements. And the Earth Corporation does this for profit, whereas the settlers from the belt do this because they need a steady income to base their colony on, as they are displaced, deprivileged identities who have nowhere else to go. Now, whereas a typical post-apocalyptic narrative, in a typical post-apocalyptic narrative, humans triumph over a foe that is humanity's lesser. In The Expanse, it's not simply Mars and Earth looking at each other this way, or both of them looking at Belters this way. Season 5 actually opens the question about we further up by gesturing towards the diversity of humans and the species as a species that alters a planet and generates a deterritorialized future. So the question about The Expanse on which its impact and appreciation hinges is to what extent it offers a progressive and critical commentary on our current predicament. What is the ontological nature of catastrophe? How do we negotiate human evolution, biological, technical, and ethical? And can humanity transcend itself, and how will it negotiate its existence in a new ecology? Now, these questions can be reformulated and asked about the changing ecosystem of content production and distribution as well. What is the nature of content? How do we negotiate the evolution of viewing and distribution practices? Can television, now broadly defined, transcend itself? And how will it negotiate its existence in a new ecology? In television studies, there's been a lot of research lately about the ways the pandemic interfered with viewing habits and with the distribution of viewing between streaming services and PSB, or linear television. Many have seen the proliferation of viewing between the proliferation of digital content distribution as that which brings about the decline, or at least the radical repositioning of broadcast television, while others have taken a more celebratory approach to the broadening of digital perspectives. Some have argued this shift towards streaming services produced new and exciting consumption practices that complement traditional forms of viewing. Others have argued digital platforms potentially open new horizons to an even more pronounced transnationalization of television via a wider distribution of local productions, as well as international cooperations, or the circulation of cultural legacies. This is obviously a vast topic approached from the aspect of industry, policy, and regulation. I would like to focus on audience engagement, not necessarily in the sense of what and where audiences watch, but to highlight a somewhat unilateral and unidirectional quality of the already existing research. We tend to look at what is offered, what is available to audiences, and we tend to overlook the fact that it's not always the abundance of contents enhanced by algorithmic governance that attracts audiences to specific streaming platforms, not simply the drive to explore, yet again, the vastness of the offer. There's evidence suggesting that in specific cases, audiences actively seek out particular contents and will be driven to where that content is available. In other words, demand on the part of the audience and audience choices, their preferences, will impact back on the industry, as, among others, Wilda Shankar Sundar seems to observe in her most recent book, Television Drama in the Age of Streaming. The question is, how does this impacting work? Will it be enough to bring a show back? Maybe. Obviously, Jeff Bezos saw a great marketing opportunity in the expense to further establish Prime as a brand and as a platform, not to mention the potential to expand further both geographically and demographically by attracting specific niche audiences to the platform. And also, in retrospect, to provide a mutually profitable symbiotic context for the show and for his space exploration program. It is not by accident that Amazon Prime also features a number of highly popular space-themed dramas and documentaries, and it's not by accident that the vast majority of the space-related dramas would primarily be available on streaming platforms such as Netflix, Prime, or Apple TV. So my hypothesis, very simplified, is that audiences primarily interested in specific types of contents will go where that type of content is available to them. And platformization is particularly conducive to those preferences. And it seems to me that there will have been a specific demographic, one that perhaps would not be too hard to identify, that does not mind changes in the media ecosystem for the simple reason that they look for premium content, premium drama. It is, of course, up for debate whether premium equals Netflix or Prime or HBO. In the fandom, however, there will be little concern for the original network or how originality is defined as long as the content in question continues to be delivered. What will be discussed in the fandom, this is where I want to go now. What will be discussed in the fandom is the conceptual narrative, the aesthetic qualities, the question of authenticity, and most importantly, relatability, the relatability of the program in question. And I believe that The Expanse delivers big time on the latter, not just with the portrayal of batters and as an allegory of the deprivileged and the disenfranchised migrant, nomadic, excluded, criminalized identities, but also in regards to the much praised inclusiveness of the show, starting with the polyamorous family of Kamina Drummer in season 5, and the ethnic diversification of its female leads, which the show handles very, very naturally. This kind of diversification doesn't feel artificial, or it doesn't feel like a manifestation of tokenism. In terms of narrative, sorry, yeah?
If I just may briefly interrupt you, have 3 more minutes.
Yeah, okay. 3 more minutes. So The Expanse inscribes itself into a growing body of space-themed screen texts that draw on a kind of hyperrealism that excels in attention to detail, the authentic representation of the science behind life in space and the colonization of the solar system. And it comes with a visually hyped, but at the same time relatable, believable aesthetic design as far as the representation of spacecraft, interior spaces are concerned. So the common denominator, interestingly, for these narratives is the emphasis on the fact that space sucks. I need to find that. Where is it? Okay, I don't have that. I did have an image, which I actually took from the Expanse fandom page, but apparently it disappeared somehow. Apologies for that. Okay. These narratives are narratives about space in a way that at the same time they deconstruct, both narratively and visually, any attempt at the glamorization of the colonization of space and focus on the realities of hardship in an environment that is unwelcoming, lonely, and curiously claustrophobic. And the fandom responds quite well to that. So as a sort of partial conclusion, I would like to say that there's plenty of references to changing media ecosystems and environments and disputes about how institutions try to face and live up to those challenges. But to be able to think how to live up to the challenges, one would need to understand what this changed media environment really entails. And this is impossible without paying more attention to user/audience trends and preferences, and without factoring in those shifts into a more complex mapping of the media landscape. This is not to suggest that the research on audiences is underrepresented, but it's only to suggest that perhaps this research could be nicely complemented by research that looks at television as well as online services as specific cultural forms that exist in a coextensive, supplementative manner. So instead of talking about antidotes to Netflix, instead of repeatedly arguing for the return or revival of linear television, an approach that allows for more fluidity across media and platforms could be attempted, where emphasis would fall on continuity and synergy rather than on demarcation, because that synergy already exists, and at least in certain small market contexts, it seems to be the driving force of local production as well as of the transnationalization and mobilization thereof. And I will thank you for your attention, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, David, and you have hit the time spot perfectly.
Oh, okay, I'm happy to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we move on to our next speaker, who is JP Kelly. And JP is a lecturer in television and digital media at Royal Holloway at the University of London. His current research focuses on the datafication of the television industry and the impact of new media technologies on storytelling practices. He has published several articles on these topics in journals, including Convergence, Television and New Media, Media Culture, and of course, Critical Studies in Television. So we are looking forward to your talk, JP, which is entitled What's in the Box? Methods for Archiving and Analyzing Video on Demand Catalogs.
Indeed. Thanks so much for the introduction. So yeah, so actually let's start with the title, which is sort of deliberately scratched out here. So the title is "What's in the Box?" with the "on" kind of scratched out. So I just want to kind of clarify, I suppose, first of all, that the title is not an obscure reference to that infamous line from Seven where Brad Pitt asks what's in the box, and it turns out to be Gwyneth Paltrow's head. It's actually a reference to the way that television is increasingly available in boxes, or more specifically via on-demand platforms in the form of collections or catalogues, and no longer just only on the box, to use the parlance of televisual flow. So that was the kind of idea behind the title. So the title gestures towards this shift, a shift that we're all very familiar with by now, one in which Lobato says, quote, "Television is acquiring unevenly but substantively a database form." And so like this, the paper is going to do two things. Hopefully these slides are going to work. Yeah. So firstly, I'm going to argue that whilst we often think of these platforms in terms of catalogues, archives, libraries or collections, we need to also conceive of and examine them as databases as well. So in this first part of the presentation, I'm going to lay out some of the conceptual groundwork around databases and to demonstrate how and why it's necessary to think of iPlayer or any other kind of platform in these terms. And this then feeds into the second part of the paper, which focuses more on the methods we might then employ to examine and analyze streaming platforms directly. So originally, the second part was going to be the sole focus of my paper when I first proposed it. However, the more research I did around iPlayer's data structures, the more I realized just how much work needed to be done to, I suppose, expand our knowledge of these systems before we can actually get to the stage of developing new methods and analyzing these platforms. So basically what I ended up doing was opening a very large can of worms, and quite a technical can of worms at that, much of which I'm still trying to get my head around. But let me start with this assertion that we should consider iPlayer or any streaming platform as a database. So in some ways, my starting point for this is with the work of David Berry, and specifically his notion of what he calls the constellation stack or stack constellation. So drawing on Adorno's notion of the constellation, Berry argues that we should think of these systems as layers of technology and that it is, quote, helpful to understand these layers as elements in a constellation of technologies that make up the technological stack, end quote. So what this means is that we don't just examine the most visible points or parts of a technological system, but that we take a broader view that captures all of the components and processes in these systems, many of which we tend to overlook or ignore. So, for instance, we focus a bit more on interfaces, I think, rather than algorithms and databases. So we could say very crudely that for most people, and for many academics, including myself, because I've kind of written more about this visible point, BBC iPlayer is primarily an interface. It's the final and most visible point of contact. However, it is comprised of a series of layers or galaxies, if we want to continue with the Berry's constellation metaphor. So, for example, we have the interface, but beneath that, we also have the algorithm. Beneath that, we also have the database, which is distinct from the catalog, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. And this, what you're seeing here, is by no means a complete picture of the stack constellation of BBC iPlayer. And we'll see in a moment just how complicated this arrangement gets. So Berry's work is helpful because it makes us aware, rather, of the complexity of these constellations. As he says, quote, "Focus on stack constellations, go beyond the specificity of the device as a privileged site of research, and reorient critical attention toward the complex computational layers that constitute them," end quote. So in short, he's making a case for looking under the hood and understanding how all of these different layers work together. And I think importantly for us, this would be the implications these kinds of systems have then for the viewer, for our experiences, for things such as the delivery of public service values. So what exactly is under the hood? What is iPlayer's constellation stack comprised of? I've already suggested that we can broadly break this down into three distinct layers or galaxies. So we've got the interface, the algorithm, and the database, but this is a very simplified version. So what you should be able to see here is actually what the iPlayer constellation looks like according to the BBC themselves. It's taken from a 2014 blog post, but they've assured me that the models are all still relevant to today. So I think we're in this future phase. This is kind of where we're at right now in terms of the architecture of iPlayer. And it's interesting to see the evolution of this over time from quite a complex constellation to one that seems to be much more streamlined. And we can see that the database, the thing that I'm mostly just talking about today, is just one tiny little component in this system. And in this third phase, this what's marked as future here, but is sort of our present now, it suggests that there is a kind of simplicity to the design, but actually it's much more complicated than this. So I want to just unpack this further still for a moment. So I've taken the liberty of labeling the various layers of this diagram, this quite technical diagram, in slightly more layman's terms. So first we have the metadata input, and this is managed by Red Bee Media. I believe still they are in charge of doing this. This metadata then goes into the database, which then connects to an API, which allows the interface, whether that's BBC iPlayer or the BBC website, to query and request content. But the constellation is actually far more complex than even this image suggests. So there are various other elements missing. So where is the algorithm, for example? Where does that fit into this kind of schematic? Where is the server containing the actual assets? So the audio video files that feed iPlayer and the BBC website. And we could unpack each stage further still. And I don't have time to do it for every stage, but just for example, if we look at the metadata input stage, this requires a variety of technologies, practices, policies, standards, and even human judgments. So we can really start to appreciate just how complex these constellations are. But I'm somewhat digressing here. My interest for the moment is just on one aspect of this constellation, as I said, and that's the database. And at this stage, I think it's important and helpful to disambiguate the term and set it in relation to some relevant work in the field. So in recent years, we've seen some really excellent work on archives, collections, libraries, and catalogues, but these are distinct from a database. They also invite different kinds of critical considerations. So, for example, archives are often tied to notions of historical record or cultural preservation, whereas collections are more often aligned with the construction of personal identities or expressions of taste. And when talking about VOD platforms, these terms are sometimes employed and sometimes used interchangeably. But as I've already suggested, there are important conceptual and semantic distinctions between them. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that BBC iPlayer can't be thought of as an archive, a collection, a library, or a catalogue. It is all of these things, but it's also a database, yet has never been examined in these terms, at least not that I'm aware of. So the database has largely, though not entirely, been ignored within our field, but as Paul Dorish argues in his work on the materialities of database systems, they have their own specific properties and effects. We might then ask, what are the specific properties and effects of iPlayer's database? What kinds of data do they include? How is it structured? And if we were to get our hands on this data, which we'll see in part 2 of this presentation, what would we be able to do with it? So examining iPlayer as a database, or examining its database rather, raises a distinct set of questions. As I noted earlier at the outset of this presentation, Lobato has argued that television is acquiring unevenly but substantively a database form. And to some extent, he uses database and catalogue interchangeably in that account. However, the research agenda that he then proposes is tied to the notion of, in that case, the Netflix catalogue as an ever-evolving collection of licensing deals which varies across different territories. This in turn invites certain kinds of research questions. Again, in that instance, questions around ideological and transnational flows of content. And this work is incredibly valuable, but in addition to analysing the content of these catalogues, so what's kind of indexed, what's stored in them, what I think we need to do as well is to also pay attention to the data structures and data types that underpin these platforms, as these have, as I've suggested already, profound implications for how these platforms function. So this is a view shared by a number of others, particularly people writing in the field of like software studies. So Berry, for instance, has argued that the humanities must learn to provide critical approaches that can test and make visible archival systems and their embedded logics. Patrick Vonderow, in an article on the politics of content aggregation, similarly notes it's worthwhile studying how the databases containing those large data sets are conceptually structured in ways that enable certain perspectives and disable others. And so this is essentially also what Paul Dorish does in his analysis of the materialities and effects of different database types. He talks more about relational and non-relational database structures. So ultimately, my argument is that the structure of a database permits, prevents, and privileges certain forms of use and experience. So for instance, how data is structured or what schemas are employed has significant consequences for things such as searchability, or for what algorithm might be able to do when it comes to content recommendation. And I think these are questions maybe that are of interest to a number of people in TV studies. But all of this begs the question, what kind of data and or structures does the BBC use? And what role do these data and structures play within iPlayer's constellation stack? So in other words, what kind of uses do they permit, prevent or privilege? And then finally, how might we use these databases to examine these platforms? So one way to do this would be to look at the types of database structures that they utilize. So I've already mentioned the two models of the relational and non-relational databases. But this is quite a complex area, which I'm still myself just getting to grips with. So for now, I'm going to focus more on the types of data used, or rather what we call data ontologies. So a data ontology identifies and distinguishes concepts and their relationships, and in this instance can describe a program or a series, their features and attributes, and their relationship to other elements within the system. So for example, episodes that are part of a series, programs that belong to a certain genre or have a certain actor in common, and so on. The BBC have a number of these ontologies, including ones for food, politics, sport and wildlife, but we're most interested here in the program ontology. And this includes classes and properties such as program, episode, channel, genre, director, duration, location, and many more. So there are 85 in total. You can see on the right of this image here, there's a list of some of these and descriptions of what they are. On the left is a kind of map, I suppose, of how these ontologies all kind of work in this kind of relationship, or the sort of relationship between all the different parts of that. I don't have the time to kind of scrutinize these in detail here. That's going to be a project for another time, but I think it's worth noting just how broad and inclusive this ontology is. What I do want to do in the remainder of this paper is to focus more on methodology. So far I've argued that we need to develop a better understanding of these structures and data types, but now I want to look at how we can use some of this data ourselves. So here's where I shift to part 2 of my talk, which is more about methods. So as we've seen, the BBC are quite open about their data ontologies. You can go to the website and read, through this list if you're so inclined. However, they're much less willing to provide access to the actual data itself. So we have to get a little bit creative here. And despite the optimism of some researchers that we can simply grab whatever data we need, the reality is that access is actually very difficult, and it's also a legal grey area. So the BBC, for example, explicitly state that their metadata cannot be scraped or used without a license. Fortunately, there's a slight workaround to this, or a number of workarounds, one of which is to use a program, as you can see here, called Get iPlayer. So originally it was developed quite a few years ago to enable people to be able to search, schedule and download content from iPlayer, but specifically those running Linux, which at the time had no native iPlayer support. And I think the BBC sort of turned a bit of a blind eye to this because it was, increasing access to people who didn't have the right operating system or platform to gain content to programs. And one of the advantages or sort of byproducts, let's say, of this app is that in order for it to work, it creates an index of BBC iPlayer, literally a file containing lots of data. And there are some important caveats here, however. So firstly, it only caches program index entries for a maximum of 30 days. And this was implemented, I think, to sort of try to adhere to that rule at the time where content only had a kind of shelf life of 30 days. So sticking to kind of copyright laws. It also only indexes programs that have been broadcast. So there's no data for things like BBC Three, iPlayer exclusives, red button content, and so on. And finally, the data doesn't include the full program ontology, which we've seen a moment ago. What we get is, if we look at the documentation for this program, is it makes reference to 62 different types of metadata rather than 82. So a number of things seem to be kind of missing from here. Even more so, these 62 pieces of data aren't actually captured in the indexing stage. It actually only captures 14 pieces of data. It is possible to get all 62, but that would require essentially like making individual queries to the BBC website for each title. And the data set has 130,000, I think, unique pieces of content. So if I was to do that, I would A, probably crash the BBC servers, and also B, contravene several copyright laws. So I'm sort of avoiding that for now. I'm just sticking with the basic data that we can get through this program. And despite all these limitations, there are some key types of data here, and actually quite a lot we can do with just a small number of variables. So we've got things like the channel, the duration of the program, when it sort of becomes available, a number of quite interesting sort of metadata types such as those. So my process was to essentially index iPlayer every other day for the past 2 years or so. And each index, I didn't do it every day because it's such a huge amount of data. So each index contains around 8,000 titles with 14 variables, so 8,000 rows and 14 columns. And this is just a sort of sample of what it looks like, just the first 36 rows of any one given day across those 2 years. The next step was then to sort of what's called parsing the data, which is to take certain columns which contained multiple bits of information and kind of separate them out into distinct columns. And then that resulted then in a data set that spans just over 2 years, has almost 3 million rows, 26 columns, and 77 million observations in total, 77 million pieces of data. So this is quite a huge thing, and my MacBook, you know, is kind of struggling to kind of churn through this as it was doing some of the analysis. So this is, we're not quite in the sort of territory of the petabytes that Netflix use, but for sort of, you know, traditional humanities TV studies people, I think this is quite a kind of significant amount of data. So then we get to the point of actually analyzing the data, and rather than developing a series of research questions in advance, I took inspiration from John Tukey's model of exploratory data analysis. It's a model I used for a similar project where I analysed iPlayer's interface offerings. So it was first developed in the 1970s, but it's still very much the norm today in data science. And the idea of EDA is that it allows you allow the data to speak for itself, essentially, and you just pay attention to the most prominent features, patterns, and anomalies in the data. So I was able to do this using a program called Tableau. This is an industry standard data visualization program, and it can allow you to sort of play with data in real time and visualize things and kind of update the visualizations, you know, sort of immediately. So I am conscious I've only got a few minutes to go, so I'm going to draw to a close by just sharing a few what I think are quite simple observations, and they're kind of intended to be more like starting points rather than kind of grand revelations about anything. And I started off with just kind of counting the number of titles, unique titles that is, and given the data only indexes content that's been broadcast in the last 30 days, it's not surprising that we see a fairly kind of stable-ish figure. It fluctuates from sort of around 7,000 to 8,500 titles. But even so, there are some interesting sort of peaks and troughs in this data, and I'll talk more about this in just a moment. So 8,000 titles might sound like a lot when compared to other platforms such as Netflix, but if we count it at the level of series, we get a different picture. This is where the blue line at the bottom comes in. So what I mean here is rather than counting 30 individual episodes of something like EastEnders, we count this as one series. And I think this is, don't quote me on this, but I think this is how Netflix kind of account or their kind of APIs count their catalogue. So this indicates that iPlayer is somewhere more in the region of 1,000 different programs or brands available. And you might have already spotted these two small peaks at the bottom, and these correlate then with the two little troughs at the top. And it's quite interesting because these occur around Christmas. And what this tells us is the blue line at the bottom suggests there's this kind of rise of unique titles at these points in time, whereas at the top a kind of decline of overall titles. And, you know, my initial kind of thought on this is, oh, it's maybe because there's more one-off programming, more films and so on. And in a moment, we'll see that sort of borne out a little bit. But we can look at it from another of other different ways. So we can look at it in terms of the spread of content according to channel. So here we see as a kind of percentage broken down by channel, where BBC One has the most. This is just by count of program rather than duration. CBeebies in second, and then it kind of goes smaller and smaller. If we do it by actual duration, ignore these kinds of weird little spikes here. This is where there are kind of outages in the data, but we can see that there's a slightly different picture emerges. So this is the original one on the right by just number of titles, on the left is by minutes. So BBC One is still the most popular, as we might expect, but suddenly CBeebies has more in terms of minutes in the catalogue. We can also look at an even more granular level here. This one I think is quite interesting. This is average duration by channel. We can see, for example, this orange line is BBC Parliament, which is like this kind of pulse. It has the highest average runtime, but it also fluctuates quite wildly. BBC Two also has this kind of interesting kind of rhythm or pulse, but maybe surprisingly then BBC One is very static, almost like dead. It's this kind of flatlined thing where there is very little variation in that. So my final image that I want to show you is just genre. So although genre isn't part of that data, I was able to bring that in from another data set where I was studying interfaces. And all this does is this kind of shows us where we could maybe do some more interesting things if we can get our hands on more data. So here we can see, for instance, a couple of like heat spots in this heat map of where, for instance, film is particularly popular around these two Christmas periods, which essentially sort of proves that hypothesis from the earlier visualization of where there are these kinds of spikes of unique titles on iPlayer. So finally, I think I'm at my 20 minutes or so now. So just a couple of things to say, I guess, in terms of like where to take this research. You know, this is a very kind of cursory and quick overview, but I think a number of things need to be done moving forward. So access needs to be improved. So John Ellis talked a bit about this last week in his presentation. So perhaps read-only access to APIs for educators in particular. Combining data, so this is all just kind of catalog data, but bringing in viewer data, data from other platforms, you know, nationally, globally, and so on. Preserving data, for me, this is a really key one because as far as I'm aware, the BBC aren't kind of tracking the kind of contents of their catalog in this way, nor are many other platforms. More training and more collaborations, because this was kind of really pushing at the limits of what I could sort of do and learn. It's a huge learning curve to do some of this stuff. Developing research agendas then based on the data structures and data types. And finally, ultimately, I think all of these things will hopefully help us to develop a better understanding of these constellations of data structures, ontologies, and their effects. Thanks, I'll stop there. I think I ran over time slightly, so apologies.
Thank you, JP. It was a minute, so I think that is still tolerable.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for this fascinating insight into your data research. And we turn to our third speaker of today, Mareike Jenner, who is going to speak to us about controlling television. Mareike is a senior lecturer in media studies at Anglia Ruskin University, and her research is focused on streaming, television genre, and more recently on the cultural hierarchies in television. Her edited collection, Binge Watching and Contemporary Television Studies, will be published in October 2021. And her previous work includes monographs like Netflix and the Reinvention of Television. So the screen is yours, Mareike, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping this works. Can you see the presentation?
We can see your PowerPoint program right now.
Okay, that is fun. Sorry, my computer crashed right before this, which means that for some reason my my PowerPoint doesn't load. Hopefully it should be loading in a second. Sorry. Hi, I'm just gonna start while my PowerPoint is loading. So what I want to be talking about is essentially the idea of controlling television. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna I hope it should be here.
Now it looks perfect.
Can you see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in that case, I'm just going to go ahead. So essentially, I'm talking about the idea of controlling television. In this, I'm going to use kind of a definition of control and choice, which is a bit different from how a lot of other theorists kind of approach this issue. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. And then I'm going to talk about the technologies of control in relation to television and discourses surrounding quality TV and kind of the hierarchies of television that more or less manage or police this control. And then I'm going to talk about how that is embedded in particular economic systems of labor. Okay, so in order to talk about control, so what I'm talking here is actually control, but without power. So normally when we're talking about control, for example, Michel Deleuze, when he's talking about control societies, we're talking about control coupled with power. So in Deleuze's case, it's, for example, neoliberal power. In the case of governments, as for example, David Harvey talks about, it tends to be kind of like the power of specific economic and governmental systems. And obviously, John Ellis last week talked a little bit about how streaming services control television and what we're seeing. But all of that essentially means control embedded within specific power structures of neoliberalism. Now, what I'm talking about is the kind of control that viewers exercise with technologies like the remote control, or also when using streaming services, which is control. Like, you press a button on your remote and you really do change a channel. Like, you really do have that version of control. At the same time, that control is in power. Despite the fact that there obviously have been discourses surrounding gender and the remote control that wanted to suggest otherwise, but patriarchal power is not necessarily tied to remote controls. But what this terminology of control is kind of coupled with is the idea of choice. And that is a kind of choice that is controlled by other systems. But it is something that is really, really emphasized a lot when we're looking at marketing texts and so on. So what I want to focus on in that is actually technologies that do enable both control and choice. And a pivotal moment for that is the 1980s. It's not the only moment or the first moment or anything like that. It's just an important moment. So in 1980, the first remote control using infrared technology came out, which led to really, really important changes. So remote controls for television existed since the 40s, for other technologies a lot longer. But this kind the remote control using infrared technology meant that manufacture was cheaper, and they were also a lot more accurate. Now, the thing is, the remote controls also became more necessary because, obviously not at exactly the same moment, but kind of at a similar moment, cable TV was extended. In the US and in many European countries, it was first introduced. Now, the gaze here is, of course, a very, very Western gaze. But over the 80s and 90s, we see this extension in pretty much all around the world. Now, the thing is that all of these new channels, so we're going from 3 channels, 5 channels to 30 channels, 50 channels, 100 channels with one technology. And that necessitates that people use the remote control in order to manage that kind of choice. And in relation to that, new viewing practices develop. So specifically channel surfing, which is kind of an umbrella term that summarizes quite a few different habits of viewing patterns and behaviors. But channel surfing becomes really, really important. But what also happens is that the discourse surrounding quality TV becomes really loud. Again, this is not the first time this happened, or the first technology that came up at pretty much the same moment. So like this coupling of technology with the quality TV discourse is again not new. It's not really an accident that Robert J. Thompson called his book Television's Second Golden Age, because it's not the first time. But it is still quite an important moment for quality television, and understanding and defining what quality television is. And I think the word quality is quite important here as well. It's not just good TV, it's quality TV. So if you're watching this, if you're consuming Hill Street Blues or Miami Vice or Moonlighting or Twin Peaks, you're kind of increasing your quality as a human being, which is quite an important thing to consider when you're thinking about the kind of choices that are available and the technologies that you're supposed to be using to control them. Obviously, you're supposed to use them in order to become a better human being. Obviously, this choice is kind of given to you so that you watch these programs specifically. And these are discourses that come up several times when we have these moments when technology changes. Now, in the early 2000s, when HBO more or less tried to define or did define what quality television is, it very specifically used DVD box sets in order to sell its version of quality TV, becoming a better human being. And in fairness, binge watching is like the most convenient way to watch a DVD. Because you're not really going to change DVDs after one episode. So we can see kind of like how HBO does very much drive not just discussions around quality TV, but also around technology and the best way of watching it. And obviously Netflix, once they start producing their own original programs, they completely exploit this. In kind of like relying, supposedly, at least that's what they're saying, relying on data kind of like that they took from their DVD business in order to assess that this is binge watching. And they also very much piggyback on this quality discourse with House of Cards, which pretty much ticks all the boxes, at least theoretically. And they are kind of like trying to further that discourse, even though now they've obviously expanded quite a lot. Now, the thing is, when we're thinking about this intersection of quality television and labor and the technologies that we have to acquire and we have to use in order to exercise control, there is a way where these are embedded in neoliberal culture. So Michel Fair argues essentially that within neoliberal culture, the individual constantly has to self-appreciate, which kind of like means increasing your value as a human being, increasing your human capital. I would call them narratives of self-improvement. So making yourself a better human being by the choices you're making. And in this case, you're supposed to do the labor of watching television, but not just watch television, but watch the right kind of television. So these kinds of discourses are quite important, which is why I find it also quite relevant to think about the way that Elizabeth Currid-Halkett in her theory of the aspirational class theorizes television as labor. So she essentially develops this theory of the aspirational class, which is a group of people that is quite high in cultural capital, but not necessarily in financial capital. Capital doesn't have to. Now, the thing is that she actually summarizes it quite well when she says aspirational class productivity in leisure spills into all facets of life. Some members are never able to just relax. Even watching television, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, or the latest HBO epic. And by the way, if you followed the discourse surrounding Mayor of Easttown, you will have seen the same thing. It's about being part of the cultural zeitgeist. How else can an individual seem informed and intellectually productive at a dinner party if he's not spending free time doing things that make him seem smart and culturally aware? So we are expected to watch the good TV to become better human beings. So to conclude then, I would argue that these discourses surrounding quality TV very much police the various technologies that we have that are there to extend our choice, but also exercise control over this choice you have. So while you have a lot of programs at your disposal, make the right choice by when you're using the technologies that enable this. So all of this is kind of embedded in neoliberal labor practices and kind of the neoliberal labor on the self and self-improvement, because we obviously have to watch the right kind of TV. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mareike. And we are nearly perfectly on time. So if I could ask our panelists to switch on their cameras again. We have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. And I'm very sure that we're not running out of things to talk about. Elke has told me that the virtual raising hand function has worked best so far. I would like to encourage you to start raising your hands, and then we can give the word to you. So I can see that Roseanne has raised her hand. So if you unmute yourself, yeah, there you go.
Thank you for these amazing presentations, and it's great how they complement themselves. My question though is for Kelly. I would like to ask, in the database that you studied, how content is turning into database, and you talked briefly about spectatorship, or how spectators try and find ways to see their content, even though the database controls that. Do you see change perhaps in the database moved by these spectators? Do you think something will change to attend this new kind of consumption?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a really good question. So basically, I guess a couple of things to say is that initially it seems that BBC kind of started with this particular kind of architecture, which is called like a relational database, which suits a particular kind of interaction. But it seems as if, from what I'm kind of starting to understand from conversations with them, they've shifted to like this kind of more cloud-based computing thing where the data is distributed across stuff, because there's a need, I think, for, it's not just about like having a database that is about the content, that labels the content and describes the content. It's also obviously about how people engage with and interact with that content. So they also have all these databases about, you know, it's sort of like Netflix essentially, you know, like what you watched, when you watched it, and all of that stuff kind of, you know, gets tracked. And although there is a limited amount of kind of algorithms on iPlayer, there is still a sense that this data is important to them, and there are still some, like, if you, I don't know if anyone, you know, people here, I'm sure, have used the iPlayer. When you log on, there'll be certain rows where it's content recommended for you, or because you watch this thing or whatever. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, yeah, I mean, from my point of view, it's incredibly difficult to get data like content data, like catalog data, interface data, but it's even more impossible to get audience data, which I think is like a really interesting whole other data set. And I think, you know, I want it all. I want to get it all, get a few laptops that can sort of handle it all, and kind of start to kind of look through it. And I think all I've sort of been able to do and start thinking through is like, what is the kind of data that they're making? How is it structured? And how do those sorts of choices, I suppose, impact how these platforms might work? So does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thank you, JP and Roseanne. Are there further raised hands? Cannot see any further raised hands. There we go. Okay.
This might be a really strange question, but with all three papers that you gave, the thing that really struck me was they all seemed to say something about the kind of hidden stuff that exists with the shift towards television as or on the internet. So you know, with JP's paper, obviously that's really, really clear because of the database. But you know, even with the control thing, there's this kind of the hidden making you as a consumer into a particular kind of consumer. And with the streaming wars and the expanse, you know, how that impacts on ideas of anthropocentrism, if you want. So I wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all, that kind of sense of the hidden.
May I start? Okay, this is a very good question, and this is something that I've been trying to put my finger on for a longer time now, not just in terms of, as I was explaining prior to the session, like when we were just chatting away, my own sort of relation and, so to speak, obsession, quote unquote, with the expense, but also in terms of what I see in my teaching practice. Obviously, my position is very peculiar because I'm at a department of English, and this, well, we do talk about new media, we do talk about digital media, we do talk about television, and there's a lot of stuff on and around television going on in our programs. But obviously, this was the result or the finding of a non-representative survey that I did with my students across multiple years and various programs. But this was mentioned already in other panels as well, that there seems to be a disconnect between streaming and television. So you asked the question, even at the beginning of an introduction to television studies class, so do you, like this very lame question, do you watch TV? What kind of TV do you watch? And then, I don't know, 80% of the students, and 80% is not a number that I'm just, coming up with, it's actually 80% of my students would say, no, they don't watch TV. And then we start talking about stuff, and it turns out that they do consume very specific types of contents on platform, on various internet and digital platforms, which they don't consider television, even if it's contents that was originally produced as television. So thinking about things like Friends, for example, right? So when they watch it on a streaming platform, they would not consider that television. So apparently, yes, there's a kind of hidden something, which I wouldn't even know how to term, which kind of results in the fact that there's this at least latent and sometimes very overt demarcation of television, understood as linear television, and everything that can be consumed online, whatever that format would be. I'm not exactly sure what that has to do with the kind of neoliberal agenda that Marika was referring to, trying to sort of make us to become better humans by becoming better consumers, but it definitely ties in with what she said about control, because what students actually say is that they opt for these online platforms because they feel more in control. Even though they're not exactly more in control, but the illusion of control is definitely there. And very frequently, like depending on how old and how experienced those students would be, they're sometimes completely oblivious to the fact that the recommendations that they get are algorithmically governed. So there's always a big surprise when we talk about that. I don't know if that's an answer to the question. I don't want to kind of speak longer.
Sorry, JP, to just jump in, but I actually think you make a really, really good point in terms of, I think there's something quite distinct about how these technologies couple themselves to quality TV discourses.
Oh, yeah.
Because this exactly the same problem used to arise with, I don't watch TV, but I've seen every single episode of 6 Feet Under or The Sopranos or whatever. Like, I mean, it used to be kind of like the same thing coupled to other kinds of technologies. And I think with streaming, the boundaries are blurred more, or, well, I mean, personally, I would define streaming as TV no matter what. But I think it's exactly that same coupling to kind of quality TV discourses, which to a certain extent also has to do with discourses surrounding binge watching. Even though, like, especially within the streaming wars, binge watching is pretty much defined as the norm now, with weekly release as kind of like the elite programming and so on. But I think, yeah, this kind of like goes to the same problem, more or less.
If I just may very quickly say something to this. Yes, I mean, I really like this comment on quality, because very frequently it manifests in such a way that they would, students wouldn't just look at ratings. They don't just go to, I don't know, IMDb ratings or to Rotten Tomatoes or you name it. They don't just follow the fandom, but to their mind, if it's on a streaming platform, it's quality. And if it's quality, it will eventually appear on a streaming platform, which tells a lot about sort of the positioning, the self-positioning, and the self sort of assertion of of the streaming platforms themselves as well. Okay, thank you.
I would also, I see Christine's got a question, but I just wanted to quickly add to that as well, that I think where my research kind of connects up with all of these discourses is that, I suppose at one time we were talking about television schedulers as humans that made decisions, and now, you could talk to those people and kind of understand, the kind of cultures in which they worked and the logics they employed and, whatever. And now it's kind of like, it's all this data. It's not just data, there is still some, human intervention and whatnot, but it's just interesting because it's like, the source material almost of TV studies is so much harder to kind of get our hands on and just make sense of, because actually when we look at this underlying data and these data structures, it's quite baffling actually, like what these things are. But yet the kind of consequences of it is, for example, as David was just saying, it kind of allows the certain quality things to bubble up because of the way these things are kind of function, the way they're structured. So yeah, anyway, I was just trying to sort of tie my thing into both of those responses as well.
Okay, our next question comes from Christine, who has already opened her camera, so just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Right, yes, sorry. Yes, it's really interesting the way in which terms from old television studies are being kind of revised or refracted in new television studies. And I must say I'm not quite sure about that process, but it's definitely worth thinking about. But my question is there an accepted definition of binge watching?
Okay, I'm just going to take that one. There are different, well, I think there are some commonalities in terms of watching more than one episode at a time, which kind of comes up in everything that I've read. So personally, I've defined it as kind of like also involving the idea of the pure text, even though quite frankly, I'm kind of revising that idea. And quite importantly, that it's not on a platform that is linear television. So usually you don't use that language in order to watch 8 hours of TV, even if it's a marathon. It tends to be used in order to describe other kinds of technologies. But as far as I know, kind of like the very, very lowest common denominator that we have at the moment is really just watching more than one episode at a time.
Right, okay. Well, even I might manage that. Okay, thank you very much.
No matter how long that episode is.
Okay.
Thank you, Christine, and hand over to Catriona.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for really interesting papers and really interesting discussion. My question is to JP and to Mareka, and I want to draw in the idea of public service, because two of the threats to public service are often the idea of the infrastructure, and that technology is making public service broadcasting either invisible or redundant. So I suppose to JP, my question is around, where does public service come in the algorithm? And we often hear policymakers, and I've argued for kind of a public service algorithm. Are you more convinced from doing your research, from this kind of really deep dive into the infrastructures, that this is possible, or that this is even desirable? And it was really interesting to see your graph where you did the genres, to see things like, for instance, arts TV that I've researched on, about the kind of patterns and things like that. And I'm just kind of interested from your own perspective, how the algorithm and public service kind of overlaps. And Marika, to you, the idea of control, because that's the other thing that's a threat to public service, is that we're all we have so much choice, we're going elsewhere. And I'm really struck looking back, listening to you, and then going back to your abstract, this idea of self-improvement. And I couldn't help but think about Reith, John Reith, and his kind of idea that television will make us all better and things like that. And I was wondering, where do you see that kind of idea of self-improvement linked to public service come through in your research and in the infrastructure that you're looking at? Thank you.
So I'll go first, I think, if that's all right. So yeah, it's a really great question, actually, and it's something that's constantly on my mind. And I recently wrote a piece with a guy called Jannik Kirk Sorensen, who's based in Denmark, and him and I, we did this kind of comparison of my iPlayer data, and he's doing something similar with DRTV, and we seem to have these completely opposite views, where I think maybe I'm a bit more optimistic and think that there is a possibility for something like a public service algorithm, and he's far more sort of like, no, it's never going to work. And he has, I'd say he has a more technical knowledge than I do. He's definitely a bit more kind of computer savvy. So I kind of wonder whether actually he's just the kind of realist in the situation, and I'm just got this sort of fancy sort of dreams of what could happen. But I still think it's a really interesting area, and the BBC themselves seem to kind of like, they've talked about this before. So at the moment, there is quite a very limited amount of personalization on things like iPlayer, but they have for a couple of years now been talking about BBC Sounds in particular as a place that they are exploring public service algorithms, things that will essentially do what, meet the objectives of public service, media, and that's to kind of expose you to a variety of content, things you might not expect to be exposed to. So they seem to be interested in the idea, and I don't see why you couldn't do it. I think it's complicated and difficult to do because you have to make all these kinds of like value judgments on what do you deem as more public service than something else, or what would a diet that meets these objectives look like. So all of that stuff has to be sort of done in that sort of data schema, it has to be sort of somehow coded in and then executed in an algorithm. So I think there's a hope for it. And the fact that the BBC seem to think there is as well, I would assume that there's a possibility that this might be where it's headed. And I think they're just sort of, they'll never get rid of curation. I saw Kenneth kind of pop a comment in the room about curation as well. And I think equally like Netflix do curation, they have curated things too. It's not just pure algorithms. But yeah, anyway, I'm starting to waffle now, but I think there's a potential for it. I'm not quite sure how it would work, but I'd be interested, and this is kind of research of what I'm trying to go into, is try to figure out what would that be, what would it look like, and what would it kind of function as. So yeah, great question, thanks. Because
the counter often, and I'm interested to see what Marika is going to say to this, because the counter is often that limits choice, that we should be able to make choice, individualization and all that. So yeah, thanks. Yeah,
but because it's the idea of like the filter bubble, that we're just going to end up binging stuff because it's just like, oh, this is what the person likes, let's give them just constant episodes of Friends. But in reality, even the Netflix algorithm doesn't work like that. So, there is variety embedded into the algorithms anyway. Anyway, I'll pass over.
No, thank you. I think so. I mean, it's like obviously kind of like these quality discourses kind of come and go, and obviously in relation to John Reith, you had a quality discourse in the 50s. So that was very much meant to police what you're watching, and even if that. I hate saying not that much choice because I think it's fine, but even if there weren't 100 channels available, you still got to kind of like make this choice. I think at the moment, I think public service broadcasting often kind of struggles with this kind of Netflix approach of, and here's everything. And obviously, as John Ellis talked about last week, it's not everything, but it's too much for you to handle either way. And it can only be handled via the algorithm. And I think public service broadcasting in many ways is actually structured a little differently, particularly when we're thinking about linear television. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure I answered your question.
Thank you, Mareike, and thank you, JP. We have time for one or two more questions. And I can see, sorry, now your name disappeared, but I think it was Clara who raised her hand as well. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks everyone for great papers. I wanted to ask Mareike, because what were you just saying about the 50s and how you didn't really have that much choice what to watch? Isn't it the same with quality TV? Because they are actually telling you what to watch, what is the, the most program with the most cultural capital, something that you hinted at when you mentioned Elizabeth Currid-Hatkel, and also how the oversaturation of peak TV is influencing this, because you have too much choice. So what happens then? How does this fit into the control versus choice?
I think what we're seeing at the moment is kind of a dialing back of really, really high budget TV. And only the really high budget TV is by now counts as quality TV. So you have kind of like a discourse that is very much dominated by HBO. I honestly thought the kind of discourse surrounding Mayor of Easttown was absolutely fascinating in terms of like, this is what you have to watch, and you have to watch it right now, and you have to watch it in weekly release, which was all kind of like something that I thought we had kind of decided we're not doing at the moment, but we obviously went back to it, partly because of Disney. But I thought there was something, there's something really, really interesting at the moment going on, largely because in the context of peak TV, fewer channels, or at least American channels, I'm sorry, I need to say American channels, are kind of like choosing to dial their budget backs, which might be COVID related. I actually really don't know, but kind of like to produce more very middlebrow TV, kind of like leaving a lot of the more highbrow stuff to to actually various. It's not just HBO, they're leaving it to various different outputs.
Thank you, Mareike and Clara. And we have one more question from Gary.
Hi, I really enjoyed all of these papers, and my comments really are in between all of them in a certain way. That the first is sort of to react to David talking about his students, and I've never systematically looked at it, but it may get to the point that there, regionally where we are, that there are different television cultures, because my students clearly think of streaming as television. And I would say part of that may have to do with what they watch, that I don't think that they are necessarily sampling the newest shows, that they are watching The Office, Friends, Grey's Anatomy more, which was defined, in an earlier time, and in that way with television. But I think the notion of television as a legacy term, and that it cuts across all of these platforms. Again, I haven't this is anecdotal. I haven't systematically asked them about that, but my impression is from their, comments and everything, they really think of the whole mess of it all as television. one of JP's comments was talking about choice fatigue. And, that certainly is the case. And that tied me into what Mareka was talking about in terms of having at least the illusion of choice. But what is interesting, I find, is that the majority of viewers don't want that choice. That even in the States before the pandemic, that 2/3 of viewers were still watching television as linear television. And I would say 99 to 100% of my students are streaming, but it's really generational that way. And what is interesting, and I haven't been able to get a lot of data on this, but some of you may be aware of and know of. I've had some email back and forth with some French scholars, friends of mine, in terms of this, and they really haven't. But supposedly Netflix has an experimental linear channel that they launched in November because some of their subscribers were just not having any fun with Netflix the way that it was, and they really wanted it being curated for them. And even after the pandemic in the States, what the numbers are now, it was 2/3 linear to 1/3, and of course everyone's been streaming ever since. But now the numbers are still in the high 50s, like 59, 58% of viewers in the United States are watching linear. And so even though people are streaming more, there seems to be at least this transition going on, or this resistance to wanting to take full control, as much control as we can, of the viewing that we do.
Okay, maybe I will just very briefly respond to what Gary said about this question of whether streaming is TV or not, being a culture determined by the cultural context and by the respective geographies. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And actually, Clara talked about this in her presentation last week, where she was talking about Czech television and also the Central European context, where the status of television as such, not just the status of television studies, but the status of television as such, is still kind of somewhat how to say, disputed. So it's definitely still in a very kind of peculiar hierarchically subordinate position in comparison to film. And this, I think, plays into the way students would respond to questions about their own television viewing habits. So there's still a kind of, I don't know, stigma even attached to television, especially when it comes to Central European television. So they would even make a distinction between television contents produced locally in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, as opposed to television contents that is produced in the States. And of course, as you can imagine, everything that is produced in the States is so much better than anything that would be produced in Central Europe. I'm exaggerating, of course, but I'm doing that so as to make a point. So I think definitely that has to do with the cultures in the plural of television, and with the geographies, and with the cultural and political contexts and the disciplinary hierarchies in those specific countries.
So I wondered if I just want to really quickly add something just in terms of your point there, Gary, about the sort of legacy of television and these sort of new formulations. And the BBC obviously is maybe slightly different to something like Netflix, because it it is part of a kind of ecosystem that has broadcast as part of its whole thing. So that maybe kind of makes it slightly different to begin with. But it's interesting that they've recently started adding and trying out this feature that other platforms have got, which is the kind of watch together thing. So you can click on a thing, and they've also, it's interesting that they've applied it to certain genres. So they do it for, I think they've been doing it for like music and sports and certain kinds of genres you might think more of like having a sort of limited shelf life or live, having a liveness about them. So it's really interesting how these new platforms definitely kind of take on these sorts of features of broadcast, and there's still clearly a demand for them, and they're, you know, kind of, you know, it's not gone. They're bringing it in and linking it all together, which is quite interesting. Anyway, that was just my thought.
I also put this in chat, but I actually think Netflix never did that well in France. I know that very, very early on, when they were just there for a couple of years, there was a lot of talk of them pulling out of France because they had so few subscribers. Now, obviously, that's several years back. A lot of that, like, honestly, I don't really have the exact data as well, but I think there is quite a lot linked to nationalized television culture and Netflix strategy to adapt better to national markets. Obviously, it is still a big deal that they're kind of going back to linear television channels because the interface is actually kind of designed to do binge watching rather than necessarily make choices for you, or rather the algorithm makes those choices. So obviously it is a big deal, but at the same time, I'm always, I don't know, it's the kind of thing where I'm a bit careful just because this seems a very nationalized solution to me. But of course, there is kind of like, there are also discourses in terms of like how neoliberal culture is implemented in different national contexts. So how much labor can you really ask of an individual within different countries?
Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you, Gary, for your very, very good question that helped us bring the discussion together. We have reached the end of the panel, so I assume, Elke, you are going to switch off the recording now.